welcome to this presentation for the PSA Random Access Memories Conference. My name is William Horncastle and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Birmingham. Today I will be presenting my paper titled Electoral Competition or Party Ideology, examining the incentives behind political finance reform. This paper seeks to gain a greater understanding of the processes and interactions that lie behind political finance reforms. I use archival materials to examine whether Zim Nokora's general theory of campaign finance reform can be applied to the Westminster-style governments of Australia, Canada and New Zealand. To begin, I will introduce some of the difficulties and debates that underpin political finance regulation. Following this, I will review the theories that are forwarded when explaining cross-national variations in regulation before outlining Nokora's general theory of campaign finance reform. I will subsequently discuss methods, case selection and my data analysis strategy before concluding with some initial findings. To understand the role that money plays in elections, we begin by visualizing a race. In this context, candidates are driving cars that are propelled by fuel. The amount of fuel that each car has does not determine how fast a car can go or indeed who will win. However, fuel levels are clearly important. A car with no fuel will never leave the start line, and a car with minimum fuel may only last a few laps before retiring. As the race goes longer, cars need additional fuel to maintain their momentum. These same observations are relevant in elections. While campaign spending cannot in itself determine the outcome, a minimum amount of resource is required to get messages out to the public. No matter how strong a candidate is, without sufficient funding, they will quickly be left behind. As the overall cost of elections increases, funding differences become more stark, with elections dominated by the wealthiest candidates. Because of this, nations often use laws to regulate political finance. However, this is a highly contested topic which incorporates several philosophical debates into the fundamentals of democracy. The primary issue concerns the role of election spending in expression of one's political beliefs. On the one hand, libertarians conflate spending with speech and thus reject regulation as an undemocratic constraint on free speech rights. Conversely, egalitarians suggest that legal controls are necessary to equalize political influence and expression. These positions feed into further debates into openness, which, depending on your viewpoint, may either reduce corruption or violate the secret ballot principle, and the extension of regulation to third-party actors such as corporate and union groups. Looking at these debates, it is obvious then that an ideal or universal solution to the regulation of political finance does not exist. Different nations adopt different stances and thus place varied emphasis on private and public funding, spending controls, and financial disclosure. But what factors contribute to these differences? A selection of theories have been posited, with scholars suggesting a role for scandals, varied institutional frameworks, and party organisation in determining the shape of political finance regulations. Some suggest that shifts toward a public funding model are driven by scandals, while others claim that public funding is the natural progression of falling party membership within a cartelised party system. Reforms have also been presented as a strategic party decision, with Susan Scarrow suggesting that some parties may construct regulations solely on the basis of maximising their revenue, and that others may consider public opinion when determining whether to support a political finance bill. Although these theories can explain reforms in some contexts, Zim Nokora highlights three questions that remain unanswered. Firstly, previous theories fail to explain why incumbents support reforms that make elections more competitive. Secondly, explanations as to why rival parties work together on political finance issues remain inadequate. If regulations were all about maximising election prospects, then why would incumbents assist their rivals? Finally, the role of scandals does not appear to be as significant as some suggest. Regulations are routinely passed with no obvious scandal. To address these issues, Nokora suggests a three-dimensional model which incorporates the conflicting incentives and needs of political parties. The first incentive is for incumbents to pass legislation that helps them to remain in power. While this is a short-term goal, incumbents may also consider potential retaliation from opponents should they lose a subsequent election. This influences the longer-term second incentive, where an incumbent supports regulation that makes elections more competitive. The final incentive links to ideology, which assumes that left-leaning parties favour tighter controls and that right-leaning parties favour the opposite. An additional aspect of this model is the consideration of longer-term trends, with Nocora defining two cycles. The vicious cycle, where a series of competition-reducing regulations are implemented consecutively, is likely to occur following a change in incumbency. Conversely, the virtuous cycle, which traces a series of competition-enhancing reforms, is most likely to be triggered by a major political finance scandal. These cycles are informed by the same three incentives presented previously, so, influenced by the ideological dimension, the vicious cycle generally commences under a right-leaning incumbent, with the virtuous cycle likely with a left-wing government. The consideration of individual laws and longer-term trends, therefore, is a potential strength of Nocora's model. The aim of this paper is to examine whether this model holds when applied to different contexts. As the nation that underpins the general theory of campaign finance reform, Australia provides an interesting case to re-examine. Additional reforms have been passed since the publication of Nocora's paper, so it is worth examining the applicability of the model in the current day. While this is one justification for including Australia, the three nations were primarily chosen for their similarities as Westminster-style governments. With these three nations belonging to a group that share historical, cultural and legal ties, they are good candidates to compare experiences in regulating political finance. So this slide shows the current structure of political finance regulation in the three nations. Although they share similarities in some areas, such as offering public broadcasting for parties and requirements for financial reporting, they differ significantly in others. Australia has very few limits on who can donate or on how much parties and candidates can spend in elections. By contrast, Canada prohibits contributions from certain organisations and limits donations to $1,650. On public funding, Australia offers subsidies based on votes, while Canada offers a reimbursement of election costs. Now, although the previous slide showed the current structure of regulation in each nation, we are interested in the development of the system over time. To determine a timeline for study, I examined literature to identify key legislation that contributed to current practice. Determining a window to study required a tailored approach in each case, which sought to identify a period where the issue became salient and the foundations for the current system were laid. In each nation, major reviews were identified alongside foundational legislation. After determining the time period to study in each nation, key legislation was extracted for further examination. While Australia and New Zealand began to treat the issue more seriously in the 1980s, Canada began their regulatory journey much earlier, having introduced their first major legislation in 1974. As a result, Canada has the most legislation for study, followed by New Zealand, and Australia has the least. The data used in this paper comes from archival sources. Searching for relevant data returned a large amount of primary sources with variations in volume based on the number of regulations under study in each nation. As expected, Canada returned the most data for analysis, followed by Australia and New Zealand. As a unicameral parliament, relevant documents obtained from New Zealand only relate to the House of Representatives, as opposed to Australia and Canada, where Senate debates were considered also. After identifying data, I used NVivo for coding. Themes were recoded into groups of positive and negative statements, shown in the image on the right. This process allowed me to identify whether parties and candidates supported or opposed each regulation, and also provided a means to unpack the justifications that are provided. Findings were used to identify patterns in incumbent and challenger support of regulations, and to subsequently assess the presence of vicious and virtuous cycles in each nation. So this table summarises Australian political finance reforms in the period of study. The nature of change column summarises whether the reform is loosening or tightening the existing rules, with the following two columns indicating the approximate ideological standpoint of the incumbent and whether their main opponent supported the bill. Rows in blue indicate changes in government that were deemed important, with red rows indicating scandals. So looking at the table, we see that the first major reform is preceded by a shift toward a left-leaning Australian Labor Party government in close proximity to a major state-level political finance scandal. This point can be identified as the origin of a virtuous cycle, with 3 rounds of tightening regulations following. Although the shift in incumbency to a right-leaning Liberal National Coalition government appears to form the origin of a vicious cycle of loosening reforms, this cycle is subsequently interrupted by a foreign donation scandal involving the incumbent party. What follows is a round of tightening reforms. Although the initiation of a virtuous cycle is usually expected under a left-leaning incumbent, tightening of regulations under the Liberal National Coalition may be seen as an attempt to save face due to their role in the scandal. In the Canadian context, we see a similar pattern with a brief vicious cycle sandwiched between 2 longer virtuous cycles. While no significant Canadian scandal can be attributed as the trigger for the 1974 legislation, parliamentary debates continually reference the ongoing Watergate scandal in the US. The 1980s and 90s displayed a battle between Parliament and the courts, with several attempts to regulate third-party groups invalidated on constitutional grounds. While 2006 saw a change to a right-leaning Conservative government, the party's involvement in the ongoing sponsorship scandal reinforced the virtuous cycle, with the government passing tighter regulations as part of their federal accountability plan. The Conservatives' involvement in a further scandal initiated a new cycle. With public funding paid as a post-election reimbursement, the Conservatives were caught inflating their election expenses to maximise the value of their subsidy. The Electoral Commission subsequently withheld the party's funding, and the Conservatives followed by drastically reducing state support for parties while also curtailing the powers of the Electoral Commission. During debates, opposition parties argued that this move was about self-preservation and retaliation. However, the Conservatives commanded a healthy majority and were able to implement their changes. Following a change in government in 2015, the Liberals later opted to return powers to the Electoral Commission in 2019. In the case of New Zealand, party dynamics appear to be highly influenced by the adoption of a proportional electoral system in 1993. Prior to this, the first major regulations in political finance were introduced in 1989 through the prohibition of private electoral broadcasting alongside publicly funded airtime. While no obvious scandal precipitated this change, it appears to be influenced by growing resentment toward the National and Labour parties in this period. With New Zealand traditionally being a strong two-party system, this movement suggests an attempt to shut down development opportunities for alternative parties. The introduction of spending limits and disclosure in 1993 indicates the continuation of a virtuous cycle, albeit with a brief departure in 1995, where the 2 major parties sought to reduce opposition from emerging parties. The next reforms came in the early 2000s. Following a highly controversial 2005 election with widespread law-breaking, the New Zealand Labour Party introduced incredibly strict regulations on third-party campaigning that were described as draconian. With these regulations being unworkable in the 2008 election, 2 further bills were passed in 2010. The first loosened the regulations passed in 2007 and reduced controls on third-party campaigning. While the loosening of regulations is generally understood to be a competition-reducing exercise, the opposite is true in this case. This is because the previous controls had severely restricted external critique of government. The second bill restructured the Electoral Commission to give greater powers and independence. Nocora suggests that such reforms are more likely following or in anticipation of change towards a more competitive party system. With the number of parliamentary parties rising from 2 in the 90s to 7 in 2010, this observation appears consistent with the reform model. Finally, a single round of tightening reforms were passed in 2019, following a scandal and a change to a left-leaning government. To summarise my findings, the application of Nocora's model to the cases of Australia, Canada and New Zealand appears to fit, albeit with slightly different dynamics in each nation. Australia and Canada are common in that scandals do appear to drive reforms in some instances. Although these reforms tend to tighten the system in most cases, the obvious exception is the in-and-out scandal, with this scandal causing the incumbent Conservative Party to have their public funding withheld. The subsequent choice to reduce public funding and attack the Electoral Commission appears to be influenced by the competitive dimension of retaining power. As expected, the brief vicious cycles displayed in Australia and Canada both commenced under right-leaning governments. Finally, ideology in both nations appears important, with loosening reforms tending to come under right-wing incumbents and tightening reforms under left-leaning governments. In New Zealand, the period of study provided an interesting case with a shift from a two-party to multi-party system. Anticipating this change, the cooperative dimension was key between the two major parties who passed legislation seeking to strengthen the two-party system in the 1990s. Cooperation between these parties has continued, with the 2007 Electoral Finance Act being the only reform not supported by both. The addition of further parties formed a competitive dimension between the established and the emerging parties. Adjustments to the Electoral Commission in 2010 appear to fit this pattern, with Nocora suggesting that these changes are common in such instances. In sum, the three dimensions appear relevant in all cases, with the relative importance of each shifting based on context. So to finish, I will leave you with references that I have used in this presentation. If you wish to get in touch, please see the start of this video for my email address, which is w.horncastle@pgr.bham.ac.uk, or follow me on Twitter @WillHorncastle. These are the remaining texts used in my paper. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to hearing any questions that you may have.